joining me today. We're going to be continuing our study of Daniel, and we'll be taking a look at Daniel 3. Let's pray as we get started. God, I thank you so much for today. We thank you for the opportunity to open your word and study it together. I pray that as we go through these verses and read this story, God, that you will reveal something of yourself to us, God. We love you and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to be in Daniel 3 today. So we're skipping over Daniel 2, but don't worry, we'll talk about it a little bit. I don't want us to just skip over it completely. But we are going to be taking a close look at Daniel 3, and we'll be working our way through pretty much verse by verse through the passage. We may do a few more general groups of it. We will be working through that whole passage. But before we get there, I wanted to summarize where we've been in Daniel so far. We started last week, we talked in Daniel 1, and we saw Daniel and his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and they decided that they did not want to eat the king's food, and we talked about that last week. And so they took a stand there, but we saw that God was elevating their position and working in and through them and giving them all sorts of success and also in different ways, both in choosing to eat different food, but also in their learning and the training they were going through to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's where we left things last week. And in chapter 2, the story keeps moving on, and it moves on. It's in the second year. We have this chronological statement here in Daniel 2. It's in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and he had dreams. And the way the story goes is he'd been having a dream, possibly even a recurring dream, and it was very disturbing to him. And so he called together all of his advisors, it says his astrologers. He called them together, and because he wanted to know what it meant. But before he would listen to their interpretation, he wanted them to be able to tell him what the dream was first. And they told him it just simply couldn't be done that way. They needed to have a dream in order to interpret it. They couldn't know the dream, and they said only gods could reveal a dream. And so King Nebuchadnezzar got really angry, as he was wont to do, as we'll see later in our passage for today. And he determines that he's going to kill the whole lot of them, the astrologers, all of his advisors. And Daniel and his three friends are included in that group. And so whenever the commander of the guard comes to carry out the king's orders, Daniel speaks to him, and he asks him, why is he issuing this decree? Why is the decree? Why is the king issuing this? Why is he saying this? And so he asks for some time for him to be able to think about it and pray about it and be able to present this dream to the king. And he actually asks the king for that. It says in Daniel 2:16, he went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream. And so then Daniel and his three friends spend time praying and pleading with God to reveal to them this mystery. And in the middle of the night, Daniel had a vision of the dream. So he's able to go back to King Nebuchadnezzar the next day and tell him what the actual content of his dream, and then give him the interpretation. All because God gave Daniel that information, that knowledge, and that insight. And Daniel gives God the credit for that. Tells King Nebuchadnezzar, hey, the only one who can interpret dreams is God, and he's the one who has done this. And so Nebuchadnezzar's dream was this dream of a statue, and it had a lot of different mediums. So it was like, I'll show it again. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of a statue, a very tall statue, and it was made up of different materials. So the head of gold, and it had arms and a chest of silver. It had bronze on its thighs, legs of iron, but then the feet were made of iron and clay. And so a mixture of iron and clay, like mixed together, which would have made the feet very weak. And so then there's this giant rock that comes and destroys the statue, but The rock was from like without the human realm. I guess would be the best way to say that. And yeah, it was cut out, but it was not cut by human hands. And so this rock comes and it just crashes into the statue and everything goes to dust. And the rock, though, that struck the statue becomes this huge mountain and it fills the whole earth. And so Nebuchadnezzar is really concerned by this. And so Daniel is able to give him the interpretation that you're the head of gold and God has given you the power and the might to rule over all of the world, and kind of sets that up and then talks about these successive kingdoms. And we're not going to go into detail about what the kingdoms are because Daniel doesn't tell us which ones they are, and that's fine. So he goes through, there's another kingdom, then another, and then there's going to be a fourth one. And then finally, everything's going to be destroyed because of the clay and the iron mixture. It's going to be not a very strong kingdom. And so that's kind of the gist. It's a quick summary, but it's an important part there to note. So that's what happens in chapter 2. And it ends with the king being very, very happy. And he pays Daniel honor and then makes a statement at the end that says, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." And then he gives Daniel a higher position and gives him a bunch of gifts, and Daniel encourages the king to bring his friends along with him. And at this point, his friends start going by their Babylonian names in Daniel: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so that's where chapter 2 leaves off. And so those three become administrators over the province of Babylon. And it says, while Daniel himself remained in the royal court. So they weren't necessarily doing the same thing, but they both, all four of them, not both. All four of them were all still serving in the king's service, but we don't know if they were still serving in the same exact place or any of that. This brings us to Daniel 3, and we're going to be reading it in sections and then stopping to talk about it instead of reading it all at once. So let's just dive right in. Daniel 3, I'm going to start off by reading verses 1 through 7. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come up to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you were commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So, King Nebuchadnezzar built a statue. And we don't know, there's several things we don't know. First, this chapter does not start with any type of chronological marker. We know time has passed since what happened and what has taken place in Daniel 2, but we don't know how much. We're not really told. We don't know how many years into his reign King Nebuchadnezzar is at this point. And it's not super important for our understanding of this passage, but it's an important thing to note. It probably didn't follow immediately on the heels of this. It would have taken a long time to build this gigantic statue that was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. And it was made of gold. We don't know what it looked like, and we don't know what it was, what the statue was of. It could have been of a god. It could have been, some scholars have thought maybe it was of King Nebuchadnezzar, but it was just a statue of gold. That's what we know of it, and not 100% sure exactly what it would have been of. But I think it's interesting to connect it back to the dream. And this is kind of the reason why I wanted to summarize chapter 2. Is we have this statue of gold that Nebuchadnezzar has had constructed. And we can tie that back, and at least I think it's an interesting point to notice that he was the head of gold of this statue he had in his dream. And it's almost as if in this beginning, he calls all of these people together from all across his empire. And the Babylonian Empire was pretty diverse, and they conquered lots of different groups. I mean, they had conquered the people of Israel. And so there were lots of people groups, lots of languages, lots of cultures being represented. And it's almost like he was wanting to bring them all together and saying, here, we're all going to come together in this special festival, and we're going to have one king, and we're going to worship have one religious identity and one culture, this one empire. We're all going to be united. Maybe he was feeling a little bit threatened because of the iron and clay mixture and the destruction of the statue in his dream. And maybe perhaps he was trying to prevent that from happening. Or he just wanted to have a statue of gold and have people worship it. We're not told very much information about exactly why, but it is interesting to kind of to contemplate his motives and think about what was driving that. And I can't help but think that something about that dream had unsettled him a little bit. And so they have this festival, and the people are commanded to bow down to this statue and worship it. So now we're going to read the next set of verses, and we're going to read verses 8 through 15, and we're going to see what happens next. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Some troublemakers, right? Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So we get the impression from these verses that this confrontation was probably unexpected to some extent by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and perhaps maybe even uninvited. And I think it's an interesting thought, because I never really thought about it before, in the sense of, like, I always had this picture in my mind that everybody bowed down and they just stood standing. But it's probably more likely that they were taking the same kind of tack they did in chapter 1, which was, we're not trying to make some big grand stand about, we're not going to follow your ways. It was more of, hey, we would like to do something this way, but we're still going to respect who you are, and we're going to be able to serve you as king. And so it was much more of a private, abstaining from their culture. And so it would be pretty easy to think that these three had just tried to avoid the festival altogether, or just kind of remain unseen somewhere. And so in that way, it does seem that it was probably unexpected, and they were not out there trying to actively say hey, we're not make a big spectacle of not worshiping this statue. And that it just kind of seems to fit with their character as we see revealed in chapter 1. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thought. And then I think it's also interesting to point out that these advisors, so the astrologers, it's like they wanted to just throw some Jews under the bus. Perhaps they were motivated by some sort of jealousy, or professional jealousy maybe, or perhaps they were just playing to King Nebuchadnezzar's insecurity, as some of the ideas that were put forth in the commentaries I was reading this week, that they were coming out and just kind of going after these guys. And another thing I think that's important to note, though, is that Daniel's not present in this story, and we're not really given a reason why. I would think if he was around, he would have been right there with them. We definitely know that from Daniel and who he is, but he's just not there, and we're not told, and that's okay. But it's like their turn to kind of stand up and declare God's glory. So Nebuchadnezzar, as we all know, is completely angry and filled with rage, and so he has them brought to him, and then he just says some very interesting things. I wanted to look at verse 15 because I think it's interesting. He says, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So he's kind of setting himself above any God and saying that, he is better and stronger and more powerful. Like, who's going to be able to stand against him? And he gives them this choice to bow down to this statue and worship this image that he made, and then everything will be fine. You can go back and do whatever you want. And so you see this temptation to pluralism, like accepting little bits and pieces of other religions, and this push towards polytheism. It wasn't that they didn't want them to believe in their God, but they wanted them to believe in all of the Babylonian gods as well. And so everything is tolerated except for the view that there's only one God or only one way. And that's kind of what we see today, even. So there was this push for them to keep their monotheism private and to kind of just keep society happy and do the thing, nod to culture and religion of your society, and everything will be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and read Daniel 3:16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. What a response. Here they are, standing in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king in that part of the world, and their response is, we don't have to defend ourselves before you. They don't try to beg or grovel or explain their actions. They just say, we don't have to defend ourselves. And as they're standing there, they make sure he knows that they serve God. So they're standing before the king, who they are his subjects, and they supposedly serve him, but they're saying, the God whom we serve, meaning we serve God before we serve you. That's quite the affront to Nebuchadnezzar and his authority and his power. And then they move on here. And so you have this confidence. And I love that confidence. They just have this quiet confidence. And you don't get the sense that they're responding with anxiety or panic or any of that. It's just a very direct response. We don't have to explain ourselves. We serve God, and he is able to deliver us. But then they throw in verse 18, and this verse is a little bit, it sounds a little bit interesting to me, because it says, but even if he does not, we want you to know we're not going to serve your gods. So I've heard it before, people say before, well, they're just leaving it open just in case God doesn't do it. But I think that I don't want us to think of this as like them doubting. I think this is more, one of the commentators I read this week was very interesting. He talked about how this is just a further affirmation of their complete faith in God and his ability and willingness to deliver them. But this statement of even if he does not is leaving God free to do as God pleases. So he's completely able, but he's also completely free to do what he wants to do. And we know that not everybody who prays for deliverance or healing or whatever gets what they are praying for. God doesn't always answer those prayers the same way. And so here they are, and they're saying, we are going to choose to serve God no matter what he chooses to do with us. But we do expect a miracle. But we're willing to serve him even if we don't get one. That is such a statement of faith that they were willing to serve God even if they didn't get the miracle that they would hope to get, that they were confident that God could do. And so, of course, this makes Nebuchadnezzar very angry. And so let's just kind of skip through these last verses. So he is angry. It says, verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was furious, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. And then he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie them up and throw them into the blazing furnace. And so these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. And the king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they come out of the fire, and everyone is standing there looking, and they check them over, and they have nothing wrong. None of their clothes are singed, none of their hair is singed. They don't even smell like fire. And so then Nebuchadnezzar responds in verse 28, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way. And then the king promotes them in the province of Babylon. A couple things I wanted to point out here right at the end of this passage. First is this juxtaposition here of these soldiers, the strongest ones in his army, tying these 3 men up and then dying as they're throwing them into the fire. So they were obeying the orders of their king. And so we could say maybe obeying the orders and being completely loyal to this king who was maybe foolish, who was not following God, and it ended in their death. But while we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they followed and trusted God, the one true God, and they were saved. What an interesting comparison here. And then this identity of the 4th man in the furnace. Scholars have thought and talked about it being lots of different options. Perhaps you've heard that some people will say that this was an Old Testament appearance of Jesus. I've heard that as well. We've heard it was an angel, or it was God, God himself. And really, we're not given enough to go on to make any definitive statement of this is who this was. Nebuchadnezzar thought it was a divine person. But I think the most important thing we can take from this is, regardless of what the identity of the 4th person in the furnace was, I think that we can say that God was with them in that fire, in that furnace. And one of the commentators made the point that I thought was great. That they were saved in the fire, not from it. God didn't just extinguish the flames or not keep them from being thrown in or any of that. He met them in the midst of the fire and saved them in the midst of it. I thought it was a very beautiful picture. And so God delivers them in grand fashion. I mean, what a statement that God is indeed able to save. God is indeed powerful enough. I mean, we saw him saying God is able to interpret dreams. God is able to let someone else know what you dreamed about and then give the interpretation as well. But he's also able to deliver them from the fiery furnace. God is able. This is a theme that we're going to continue to see as we read through Daniel. God is able. He is powerful. And he is in control, regardless of whether or not Nebuchadnezzar thinks he really is. God is in control. I think that some of my favorite parts of this story so far, our journey through Daniel so far, really, is just what this book is revealing to us about God. About a God who is one, that he is speaking to, communicating with King Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king. We saw that in Daniel 2. I kind of glossed over it a little bit, but that Daniel tells him, he tells the king, God has given you this dream, and he has given me the ability to interpret it. And so it's like God can and does communicate to those who are far from him, but that he is also a God who acts, and he speaks, and he moves, and he delivers, and he is able. And I love some of that we're seeing as we're reading through Daniel here. And I just think this story, one of the things that is one of my takeaways from from Daniel 3 specifically, is just the quiet confidence that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had in God's ability to deliver them. They knew who they were, who they followed. They knew who they worshiped, and they were willing to stake their lives on it. And it makes me be reflective and say, am I that confident in who God is? And have I spent that kind of time with him to know him intimately and to trust him completely that way? I think that's such an important question for us to all ask, is, am I willing to stake my life on that trust? Or with the temptation to pluralism or polytheism and just keeping my true belief in God private, would that be easier to do? So just kind of a question to wrestle through. Am I willing to stake my life on what I believe about God? And I think that's an important thing for us to think about. So I hope you're enjoying this journey as we're reading through Daniel. I look forward to continuing it next week. We'll pick up and keep talking about this really awesome book and what God has to say to us. Bye.